Well, I met him plebe summer in 1954. There were 1,234 of us. We came in, most of them arrived on June 28th, Monday. I was in the Army. I dropped out of college, and so I got drafted, but the Army let me go when the Naval Academy released me, so I didn't get here until the middle of July. I don't remember meeting him plebe summer because it was very fast-paced, and you're trying to, it's the indoctrination into how to be a midshipman and how to conform with the military regulations and the academic routine. So it seems like you're running everywhere. So I don't remember meeting him actually, but I was meeting everybody else. I had to wait 2 weeks for my Army discharge. So at the end of plebe summer is when the brigade, which are the new seniors and the new second class and the new third class, come back from their training during the summer. They had been on a cruise to Europe on Navy ships. That's when they got their practical training and their first initial training in going to sea. So they call it reforming the brigade, and we're the new freshmen or plebe class. And the brigade was organized into 2 regiments of 3 battalions each. Each battalion had 4 companies, so there were 24 companies, and John and I were assigned to 17th Company. There are about 150, 160 midshipmen per company, and we live in the same dorm area. We go to class together. We have our meals together, and of course your roommates who were picked for you. You don't make any decisions on your own your plebe year. So I was assigned 5 other roommates, and I ended up with 4 of them. One of them left, and then I don't know what happened to another one. Anyway, the way you get to know each other is through the plebes indoctrination. They call it plebe year, where you're at the mercy of the upperclassmen, the second class and the first class. The second class are in charge of your plebe indoctrination, and the first class are sort of your mentors, but they can also participate. But the focus is on the second class, and we had a mean second class. They were class of 56. John, he didn't have a problem with being a midshipman. He had a problem with conforming with the rigid regulations on uniform, on appearance, on decorum, and on the indoctrination. They used to, like at lunchtime or breakfast, they would give you what they call professional questions about trivia, but they wanted a test to see how you answered these questions, how agile you were mentally, because you were sitting at the 3-inch edge of your chair, straight back with your eyes in the boat. And they did it deliberately, just put a lot of pressure on you. They'd say things like, Mr. Gamboa, I see where you were president of your high school senior class. Isn't that marvelous? We're so fortunate to have a hero like you. Would you please stand up and tell us for 3 minutes why you were elected president and some of the marvelous things you did? And you had to stand up and respond immediately. If you got nervous or they were not satisfied, they would say, Mr. Gamboa, come around to my room at 7:30 this evening. So at 7:30, well, most of your classmates were back in their room getting ready for study hour. You were in your full uniform at this upperclassman's room, and at 7:30 precisely you walk into the room and stand at attention. And then they harass you some more. And that's what's called plebe year. They would do things like assign you to window closing detail, which meant that The midshipmen like to sleep. Some of them like to sleep with their window open, nice and cool at night. Some of them like to wake up with the window closed and the heat turned on. So you got a list of rooms to go around at 5:30 in the morning. Reveille was at 6:15. And close all the windows, turn the heat on. And they would do things like put the waste paper basket to trip you up, because if you woke them up, then you got further assignments. So plebe year, they want to find out who you are, what you're made of, why you're there, what your background was. Now, I'm Hispanic. My mother and father were born in Mexico. My ancestors are French, Spanish, and Portuguese, and Sonora Yaqui Indian. So my parents came to California during the Revolutionary period in the 1918s, 1920, and mother and father met in Los Angeles, and they were married in California, and my 6 siblings and I were born in California. There were, this is the 1950s, and there's quite a bit of segregation. California Mexican kids were segregated from other kids in school. I did not, in my hometown, we didn't have that. We were a very small community. There were 25 in my senior class. But nevertheless, when I arrived at the Naval Academy, of the 1,234, there were 6 Hispanics. There were 3 Mexican Americans, 2 Puerto Ricans, and a Cuban. No, he was Spaniard. So John and I became acquainted. They would turn you up. In other words, you'd be assigned to one table of 4 plebes for about a month, and then they would change you to another table and mix the plebes up. So that's how you got to know each other. We became friends, and then 3 of us decided to room together. At the end of your plebe year, if you make it, and then you get to choose your roommates for your sophomore year. And so Jack and John and I chose to room together, and then we recruited the smartest guy in the company to room with us. We wanted to have some academic reinforcement for our room. He stood 17th in the class. He was brilliant. So by the end of plebe year, John had a reputation of being a little bit of a maverick. He had some rather notorious run-ins with first class. I'll tell you one. This happened his sophomore year. We both had the duty, and which meant that we were on watch in Bancroft Hall. So on Saturday noons, we always have a giant formation in front of Bancroft Hall. You're inspected, and then everybody else goes out in town, or the first classmen went on weekend liberty. The plebes, we couldn't go out we could go out in town for until 6 o'clock. So we would have 6 hours outside, but you had to be back for evening meal, and you remained in your room or in Bancroft Hall or in the yard all weekend. Well, anyway, John and I had the duty, so we went down to King's Hall for lunch. And they close 1/3 of King Hall on weekends because everybody's out. So we sat at a table where we didn't know the upperclassmen. We didn't know anybody that played, so we just sat there. And while we were eating, I noticed that the first classman, there was one first classman at the end of the table. He was berating the steward, who happened to be a Filipino. He had asked him to bring him seconds, and there weren't any seconds. So he was being pretty, and I could sense that John was tensing up. And then all of a sudden he bursts out and he said, "Hey, mister, why don't you pick on somebody your own size?" The first classman, he was so stunned, he said, "What did you say?" He said, "That steward is doing the best he can and you're picking on him." Well, then came the standard response from an upperclassman. "What's your name, mister?" And John says, "John McCain, third class, 17th company. What's yours?" Well, by this time I wasn't breathing. So the first classman got so flustered that he just got up and left the table. And then John got up and left the table, so I jumped up and followed him out. And he says, "It really pisses me off when I see a senior picking on a subordinate using his power like that." I said, "Yeah, I can see that it does." Well, that episode spread throughout our class like wildfire. And we sort of, that was a milestone in our company at least. And we said, well, John is our moral compass. And we never heard from the upperclassmen. But to confront an upperclassman is almost a court-martial offense, and you automatically get thrown out. But nothing came of it. One day, this is when we were youngsters, we had a Marine company officer. Each company had a commissioned officer who was called the company officer, and he was responsible for your behavior and conduct. Captain Hunt, by this time John had sort of a reputation as not really too concerned about complete compliance with Navy regulations there. So one day, we came back from class, and John went into his room, and he came out and slammed his books on the deck and went storming out the door. And so Keith and Jack and I were wondering what was going on. So we looked into his room, and all his bedding was piled on his mattress. So what John later told us what happened, he returned to his room in about 2 minutes. His face was flushed. He was really angry. So we said, "What happened?" He said he walked into Captain Hunt's office unannounced, stood before his desk, had attention. He says, "Sir, please don't tear up my bunk. I only have time to make it once a day. If you don't like it, just put me on report." And he turned around and walked. Well, we feared for his life. We said, "Oh, no, now he's confronted a commissioned officer and a Marine." So nothing happened. So that solidified our impression of John as our moral compass. And he was fearless. Well, let me tell you a preceding story. Each year you move up one deck. In our senior year, we were at the top deck. So we had to climb 5 decks. Every day, just about every day, your room gets inspected. From the time you get up at 6:15, you have to make up your room, clean it up, go to breakfast, come back, and give your room a final inspection, and then you go form up and go to class. So you're always under pressure. And by the time you're a first classman, they don't harass you much. They know you've been there 3 years, this is your final year. And unless you're just a total screw-up, you're pretty much given a free pass on everything. But Captain Hunt didn't give us any free pass. And one day, a Marine major was inspecting the rooms. And the captain happened to be coming out of his office, and he saw the Marine major going into it, and he said something like, whatever you give them, they deserve. Well, there was a messenger on watch behind him, so when we came up, our room had a report sheet for room in disorder. They found either your laundry bag wasn't in the right place or your locker wasn't made up exactly as it should. So John went out in the hall and asked the plebe, he said, who inspected our room? And he told him, and he said, did he say anything? He says, no, but Captain Hunt told him that you deserved everything you got. Oh, John got furious. He says, I'm resigning and I'm going to join the Foreign Legion. And we said, so he called his mother, Roberta, and she said, okay. So she called the commandant and she said, I know John had deserved everything he's gotten, but I think that he's being treated unfairly. So the commandant looked into it, and he withdrew the report sheet. And by this time, we'd convinced John that maybe resigning and going to the French Foreign Legion was not the best career pattern. Well, so Hunt eventually got word that the commandant had canceled. So he says there's just more favorable treatment for McCain. So in our the last semester, the company officers have the first classmen over for dinner, usually by room. Well, we were very curious as to whether, one, we were going to be invited, and two, how we were going to be treated, because the others had a nice dining room setting with all the silver and the candelabra, all the niceties. When we did get an invitation, and we went over, and we were escorted to their back deck, and he served us grilled hot dogs from the grill. And it was obvious that it was a very awkward moment for him to have the four of us there. So we left as soon as possible. And we had a great laugh, and especially by this time, the social custom was that after dinner, all the first class would gather in a company room and just talk about the gossip. And we told the story about Hunt, and that just further enhanced John's reputation. John was a close friend of the brigade commander, and Chuck Larson. Chuck Larson walked on water. He was the sixth striper. He was the president of our class, and he had he was just a very smart and sharp guy, and he obviously had a bright future in the Navy. And he and John had gotten acquainted during the cruise, one of the cruises, and they became good friends. And John would invite us to his parents' home on Capitol Hill for parties, because he'd gone to school at Episcopal High, so he knew a lot of girls and he knew a lot of guys that would host parties. So if you wanted to go to a party with John in Washington, D.C., you'd get an invitation from him. And he would always take us, and Larson was included in the, well, I don't know how it came about, but we just started calling ourselves the Bad Bunch, because we were noted for our fun parties and just cutting a wide social swath through Washington and Annapolis. And I don't know how we got the name Bad Bunch, but that's what we were called. I was very fortunate to get to the Naval Academy. I wasn't going to do anything to risk being expelled or getting an excessive number of demerits. Um, John did, and there was also a beer hall called Town Hall. It was just beyond the 7-mile. The limit of liberty for midshipmen was a 7-mile radius from the center of the chapel dome. You couldn't go beyond that 7-mile limit. And the guys would sneak out there and have some beer and come back. Usually the guys that went over the wall. And John did that a couple of times, and we just prayed that he wouldn't get caught. There was a physical wall, but there were places in the wall where it was relatively easy to climb over it. And only those who were interested in going over it knew where it was. We met Roberta and her husband, John's father, who was a Navy captain. They had a beautiful home. In fact, they donated it to the Republican Party, so it's the Capitol Hill Grill now, and part of it is part of the Republican National Committee. So it was a large house, a lot of rooms. So John thought it was his duty to fill it with midshipmen. So he invited us to their house, and they would, at first, he just took his roommates. So Jack and Keith and I were invited for a weekend at his house. And we would have dinner with his parents, and then we would go out to a party that John had arranged. And I remember thinking, wow, this is the first time I've ever sat at a table with elaborate china and silver and crystal and candelabras. But she was so gracious. She made you feel like this is the way you normally have dinner. She was a perfect hostess, very charming. And John's father was the most inspirational naval officer I ever met in my whole life. We just loved him. He was so patriotic, and he was so interesting. And he would show, one time when we were there, he showed us a film of one of his submarine attacks on a Japanese ship, taken through the periscope. So that was fascinating. And in fact, his father actually sank a Japanese destroyer in a sea battle, and he shot it, he torpedoed it with the most difficult shot you can make as a submariner, and that is a down-the-throat shot, because you're coming at each other head to head, and he fired the torpedo and sank. Well, in the end, when you have to report these incidents, and one of the endorsers said, well, he could have done it a lot easier than a head-to-head shot. I said, no, he was a McCain. But our routine when we arrived at the house on Saturday was to go to the study where the captain would be. And he would talk to us about how, we always had to tell him how we were doing academically and so forth, and if everything was okay. And usually there would be a congressman visiting with him. So he would introduce us as the future leaders of our Navy and our nation, and pump us up. We used to call that our regular shot of blue and gold. But it was always a thrill to be with him. He's a very handsome guy, gray hair, and looked very much, he just emanated power and strength and charm. And he had a great sense of humor, and John had great respect for his dad. They often clashed, but he would never be insubordinate to his father. I don't even know how the argument started, but we were, John's father, he was a captain then, he'd come down on a Saturday to take us to lunch. And for some reason, it was just John and me. And they'd gotten into a discussion It might have been related to the treatment of the first class of the Filipino steward. I don't remember. But John was questioning his father about how that could happen in today's Navy, where a senior would treat a junior so disrespectfully. And his father was trying to explain it to him, but John would not accept. So they got into a bit of an argument as we were walking back. And John was walking at a fast pace, swinging his left arm, and I remember distinctly watching. I said, these guys are so much alike. His father was walking the same way, swinging his left arm. So they just finally accepted the fact that John was not going to yield on his perception that the first-classman had been unfair and had deserved to be punished. And that was that. But it was the only time I ever witnessed the intensity of both men. I said, wow, these are powerful individuals. They're combatants. That's the best way I can describe it. Their natural combative instincts, their courage, their fearlessness in a confrontation with the enemy. That's the way I interpreted their behavior. And I did not have a military background, and I had never been around sailors or naval officers. So I would just say that they were strong and courageous and inspirational naval officers with a penchant for leadership. It was just a natural ability. You can't teach that kind of leadership. You have to be born with that. And they were and are. His grandfather commanded a task force under Bull Halsey. They were all close friends, and John's father, I think John's grandfather commanded Task Force 38. Admiral Spruance commanded Task Force 58. They would rotate the task forces. It was the same task force, but when Admiral McCain was command under Bull Halsey, it was Task Force 38. They'd go out on a mission and a series of operations. They would return usually to Ulithi, which was a huge base of islands and lagoons where the fleet could anchor and replenish and refuel, get replacement pilots, and so forth. So McCain would go out on an operation on Task Force 38 and then come back, and then Spruance would take over, and they would go out while McCain's staff planned for the next operation. This was pretty much the routine in the last year of the war. And when the war ended, John's grandfather was in command of Task Force 38 off the coast of Japan, bombing and attacking Japanese land targets. So I believe he fired the last shot of World War II. And of course he was not in good health. And these are stories that John has told us. And he wanted to go home. He said, in retrospect, they think he might have had a heart attack. Anyway, Bull Halsey says, you're going to the Missouri, you're going to be here for that surrender ceremony. I don't care how you feel, because you're one of the reasons we won. So his grandfather stayed. His father was bringing a Japanese submarine, in command of a Japanese submarine, bringing it into Tokyo Harbor. So he wasn't at the ceremony. But they met afterwards and had lunch, and then he flew home the next day and arrived home 2 days after the ceremony. And they had a big reception at his house, and he died. He had a heart attack and died at the party. So he was a 3-star admiral, and he was posthumously promoted to 4-star admiral. And when John's father made 4-star admiral, they were the first 4-star admiral father's son in the U.S. Navy history. Well, John was aware of his legacy. I mean, the McCains go all the way back to the American Indian Wars before the Revolution. And he is a member of the Society of the Cincinnati, which is an association of officers from George Washington's staff who got together with their French counterparts at the end of the war and formed the Society of the Cincinnati. The Cincinnati is a Roman farmer who takes up arms in defense of the empire. So that's probably the most prestigious Revolutionary War association, and he's a direct descendant. And I think one of the McCains was a West Point graduate, and one of them was a general in the Confederacy during the Civil War. So they're just a family that has a dedication and a heritage and legacy of military service to America. And so with that, we always felt that was a tremendous weight of responsibility on John, and which, in my opinion, is what made him a little bit rebellious, because he didn't have a choice like we did to select what we wanted to do in the Navy. It wasn't that he was preordained, but he certainly couldn't say, well, I'm not going to serve in the Navy. I'm going to go in the Air Force. He just intuitively felt. But all the time we were rooming together, there would be visitors to the Naval Academy, a lot of them flag officers during World War II. They all knew each other. And whenever one of them, who was a close friend of his grandfather or his father, was visiting the superintendent, he would ask to see John. So we would come back from last class, say, Admiral so-and-so will be in the rotunda at 4:30, who would like to say hello to you. So after dinner, he would tell us who Admiral so-and-so was. We were just in awe. I mean, we'd read about these guys in the history book, and then we'd meet one of them through John. So with that kind of relationship and that kind of association with his grandfather's peers and his father's peers, had to have a tremendous psychological and emotional impact on him, because he was, and in fact, we had to write a term paper for our senior year history class. And what he did is he wrote to all the admirals, said, could you send me your impressions of my father or my grandfather? So he would read us these letters about how both Halsey felt about Slew McCain, and it was like having live history. And so we learned a lot about the Navy and the culture and the tradition of service. And I know it was a big factor in my choice of being a naval officer, the indoctrination. Now, let's go back to Roberta. And then we never knew how many people were going to end up at the McCain household, because after we would leave the party and coming home, John wanted to circle around to the favorite midshipman watering holes, like the Willard Hotel, and see if anybody had a place to stay. So we would usually pick up 2 or 3 classmates, and he'd find someplace to probably kicked his brother out of his bed. Anyway, one morning I came down early, and Roberta was in the kitchen cooking, and she said, how many of there are you, Frank? I said, I don't know, Ms. McCain, I'll go check. So I came back, I said, there are 13 of us. She said, so she gave me a $20 bill. I said, run down to the quarters, get me some milk and eggs and bacon. I haven't got enough to feed you all. So I always thought, well, she kept feeding us, we kept coming back. But they were tremendous. And when I was in the Navy, whenever I had an opportunity to call on him, I did. And when I was a lieutenant, he was in command of the Atlantic Fleet Amphibious Force at Little Creek. And I was stationed in Norfolk, and I went to see them. I was a lieutenant. And I told Roberta, I says, I'm thinking of becoming a career naval officer. And she said, well, if you're going to do that, then pick all the hard jobs, because that's how you're going to get promoted. And that's what Jack did, her husband. So I ended up doing 17 years of sea duty. But I ended up with command, so she was right. Surface warfare officer. There is he doesn't claim to be a Mexican American, but he was born in Los Angeles, and class of 42. He was an aviator, and he commanded a carrier during the Vietnam War. So I'm very careful to stipulate that I'm the surface warfare first. And I even wrote a letter to the CNO, said, in my memoir, I make the claim. I said, could you please tell me if I'm the first? Well, President Nixon changed the 1970 census to count for the first time ever in U.S. history the Mexican Americans, the Puerto Ricans, the Cubans, the ethnics. They identified their ethnicity. Otherwise, they were Caucasian or Negro or white or yellow. So President Nixon changed all that. So the Navy did not identify Mexican Americans until 1977. Well, I had already been out in the fleet, and they had listed me as Hispanic. So when I was trying to verify this, I called the registrar of the Naval Academy, and she said, for about 2 weeks they tried to search it, and they said, we can't. So I estimate that I'm among the first 20 to graduate from the Naval Academy, and I'm the first to command a ship. That's a little exaggeration. Nobody's sloppy at the Naval Academy. But one of the rituals, especially when you're wearing your Navy blues, is to brush them off. And we were issued clothes brushes. And a ritual was before you went out to formation, as your roommate brushed your uniform off to make sure there was no lint or dirt or food. And he went through all that ritual. But beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and the senior inspecting you can overlook some imperfections in your collar or the way your tie is tied, or whether you got a close shave or you haven't got your hair cut. All of the grooming standards are pretty much what your impression is, but no one's ever sloppy. I think they were just exaggerating to make a point. He did just enough to get by. Nobody is cast from the same mold at the Naval Academy. You come from 50 different states, different cultures, and there's obviously going to be clashes of opinion. John was not a good person to clash with because he could marshal his facts very forcefully and very adept. And he just had a way of confronting you, not belligerently, but forcefully. And I never saw him lose an argument. And they would argue about anything, you know. He loved history, so nobody ever challenged him on history. But he was a little bit temperamental too. So I'm sure there were times when he had what others would consider a pretty strong confrontation, but it was just John's mannerism. But he never held a grudge. And he was friendly and outgoing, and he attracted a lot of friendships because he was entertaining and interesting to be around. And he was charming with beautiful women. And so you could do no wrong to associate with him, but I would never characterize him as sloppy. I would say he didn't measure up to the highest standards of like Chuck Larson, who was the brigade commander. He had to have a spotless uniform and a perfect shoe shine every time, and he managed to do it. The aviator world is quite different from the surface warfare world in the fleet. I would say that Navy pilots exhibit a different personality and camaraderie and spirit than do destroyer sailors, for example. It's just the nature of their culture, of that community, the aviation community has a different culture than the surface warfare or the submarine community or the civil engineers. They all have their unique culture. And if there are strong personalities everywhere, and inevitably there are clashes, but the difference is John would never bear a grudge. And once an argument was over and settled, it was over. So he didn't create an enemies list, as far as I know. He remained pretty popular. He was, because of his name, he was always well known. So, but he never considered that a burden. It was a source of pride to him. He was a wrestler and a boxer, and we all had to play sports. We had intramural sports like softball and flag football, or battalion football, and baseball, and wrestling and boxing. And he ended up as a boxer. He'd been a wrestler and a boxer in high school, so he followed that up. I'd played football in high school, so my first classman was the battalion coach, so I played football, whether I wanted to or not. I'm not sure if he won the company boxing championship, but if not, he's probably pretty close to it. He was a fearless boxer. As a student, well, he did enough to get by, but he just wasn't interested in being a star man. And if you don't start off your first year and building a reputation of being a serious student and who is going to excel at the Naval Academy, then you just struggle to make it through. In our room, here's what I mean. Keith Bunting was one of the smartest guys in the class. He went into nuclear power and commanded submarines. But he stood number 17. Jack was equally smart, but he was fun-loving and not as disciplined as Keith, so he stood about 350. I stood 667, and John was 5 from the bottom by choice. So we always used to say that the leaders of the class and the fleet came from the lower half of the academic standings. Nobody ever believed it, but you had to have something to say. For example, if you assumed because of his class standing that he was an ignoramus or not very bright, you would be quite surprised when you had a dialogue with John McCain on a topic of interest. So even though he finished low academically, nobody considered him to be anything less than an intelligent person. Very, very well informed. In our company and informing the bad bunch. But yes, he was very serious about any leadership assignment. But let me tell you about the bad bunch again. I had pretty high Greece, which was aptitude. And so our senior year, I was called in by the Captain Hunt for an interview for company commander, because you had a midshipman command organization of platoon leader, squad leader, company commander, company sub-commander. So I came in to see Hunt, and he said, "Mr. Gamboa, you're one of my candidates for company commander." I said, "Thank you, sir." He said, "But I have a problem with you." I said, "Oh." So I just kept my mouth shut. He said, "You hang around with a group I call the backroom boys." He said, "If I select you to be company commander, will you disassociate yourself from that group?" I said, "No, sir, I only have so many friends. I'm not going to lose any of them." He said, "Thank you very much." So I came back to the room, and John and my roommates were waiting. John said, "What did he say?" So I wasn't about to tell him what Hunt had told me. I said, "Oh, he just asked me some innocuous questions about leadership," but I didn't get the feeling that I was one of his top candidates. Oh, because John probably would have gone down and confronted him that you're being unfair to Frank. So I didn't want to provoke another confrontation with John and the captain. And that's the kind of loyalty he displayed to his friends. Our values are like anybody else, but there's a greater emphasis on integrity, on truthfulness, on loyalty, on honor, on faith, and loyalty. I mean, we pledge our service to protect and defend the Constitution. That's a sacred oath. So that focuses your mind and your energy and your outlook. So I think that's what makes us different from a graduate of the University of Virginia or Maryland or Harvard. They're devoted to making money or being a doctor, but they're nowhere in their oath or their diplomas does it say, "And you're dedicated to support the Constitution of the United States." That's unique among the military. So I think having that kind of commitment to our country sets us apart a little bit. Concern for people. If you're not interested in being responsible for the behavior, the welfare, and the performance of a group of people, then you're not cut out to be a leader. Because the only way you're going to get things done is through your people. You can't do it all. So you have to learn to delegate. And if you're going to delegate, you have to have trust. You have to be able to inspire confidence in an untrained, relatively inexperienced subordinate to take a share of the leadership load and the management responsibility for the group. And I think a leader who enjoys that, who is motivated by trying to inspire his subordinates, and who has genuine concern for their performance and their welfare, has the basic requisites for leadership. If you're not interested, if you're a loner, if you're not comfortable standing in front of a group of sailors or Marines or soldiers and tell them that they have to do some unpleasant things, and to be able to demonstrate by your precept and example what you mean, and at the same time maintain your sense of honor and trustworthiness. They have to believe in you. They have to trust you. I saw him among his crewmen, a picture, and I was just watching the way he related to them, just the way he smiled and engaged with each person. So I said, he just looks like a normal leader to me. There was nothing spectacular or thing. Those are created by situations, not by your own aspirations. for leadership. You're put into situational leadership where you have to perform. And that's when your leadership skills really come in to the forefront. With a lot of humor. They enjoyed coming around to his room, to our room, because we would make them dance and sing and entertain us. We weren't interested in browbeating them. There were plenty of people who could do that. So we just enjoyed, we knew how to run them, and if we found their personality they weren't have the proper attitude, then we would get a little bit more serious, but we were never mean. We were hard but fair. I just think Marines have a different culture of discipline and subordination, and it's a lot different than the aviation community, and a lot different because they're in a real life and death situation most of the time when they're engaged in their military occupation. I mean, I admire the leadership they are able to demonstrate and have to. I mean, my last operation was on Iwo Jima as a squadron commander, and we were simulating rescuing an ambassador and his staff, evacuating him by helicopter. There was a company of Marines that flew over from Okinawa to be the ambassador. So it's called an MVAC. And the Marine Amphibious Group always practices this because that's one of our missions. If there's a public riot or civil unrest and we have to safeguard the American embassy, then we always have a plan to evacuate them. So I went over afterwards to pay a call on the two Japanese captains. One commanded Iwo Jima, the other commanded the air base. And they took me down, the escorts took me down to Invasion Beach. And I walked on it because I had read a book about, there were like 26 sailors and Marines that were awarded the Medal of Honor for that invasion, most of them posthumously. And I sank in to the sand. I said, how did they possibly come across that beach under withering fire? So they took me around and we went up to Mount Suribachi, and there's a surveyor's mark in the dirt where the pipe went in. And so there was a little pebble next to it, so I picked it up, put it in my pocket. So I had a little pebble from that site. But you're overlooking the entire island and Invasion Beach. There were like 1,000 ships there for that invasion. So I read about the Marines and how the battle went. I mean, that kind of leadership and heroism, I seriously doubt I would have that capability. So all this is to say that John McCain and Captain Hunt were vastly different in personality and the way to relate. And I think Hunt was misassigned at the Naval Academy. He should never have been in charge of it. He just didn't have the personality to deal with sailors. He can treat Marines a little rougher, but you can't treat midshipmen that way. And I think it was just a basic difference in personalities. I don't think he had any grudge against McCain or vice versa, although John thought he was treated unfairly. Okay, let me tell you one story about Captain Hunt and me. One day when I was a senior, I came up to my room alone. I don't know why. But anyway, the mail had just arrived on the deck, and it was next to the watchkeeper's stand. He had a kind of a table on 4 legs. And so he would gather up the mail and sort it, deliver it to each room. And on top of the pile was a Sports Illustrated magazine. And so I picked it up and I walked into my room, and then right behind me, I didn't know he was there, was Captain Hunt. And he said, "Mr. Gamboa, is that your magazine?" I said, "No, sir. It's Midshipman so-and-so's down the hall." He said we could read it. He said, "Put it back." So, well, put the magazine back. He didn't say anything else. I came back from last class, and I had to report to the battalion office and sign a Form 2, which is a misconduct report. And then the charge was I was tampering with U.S. mail. So I had to write a statement. And about 3 or 4 days later, I was called on to the commandant's office. And the assistant commandant, who was a Navy commander, he said, "Mr. Gamboa, I just read your statement. Let me see if I understand it correctly. You're charged with tampering with the U.S. mail. That's a federal offense, and you'll be expelled." I said, "Oh my God." So I said, "Well, our plebes told us, maybe incorrectly, but that we could read their magazine whenever it was available." So I just came up, and it was there on the floor, hadn't been delivered yet, so I just picked it up to take it in my room, scan it, and I was going to put it back. And Captain Hunt observed all this, and he placed me on report. He says, do you have possession of that magazine? I said, "No, sir, I put it back on the mail." He says, "Is that all there is to this?" I said, "As far as I'm concerned, sir, I never thought I was tampering with the U.S. mail." He said, "I hope not, because that's an expulsion offense. That'll be all, Mr. Gamboa." So I went back and told my roommate, I said, "John, once again, got pretty fired up." He just stopped around the room saying a few expletives about Hunt and his character. But the charge was dismissed. It was changed to conduct unbecoming or something. But I got 40 demerits and lost a weekend. So that's the kind of guy Hunt was. John was an avid boxing fan. Sugar Ray Robinson was his hero. So he decided first class year he would talk to some of the guys in our company. And he got 5 guys, including our roommate Jack, to buy the TV set. John never asked me, and I never volunteered to participate. I was one of those, like the brigade commander, that would come to a room Friday night after dinner to watch television. So pretty soon the word spread, so if you want to watch the Friday night fights, just go to the McCain room. So we gathered quite a crowd, and this went on for about a month. And nothing happened. Then one day, Jack Dittrich was alone in the room, and Hunt came in. He said, "Mr. Dittrich, would you come with me, please?" Acting like a real detective sleuth, you know. So he took Jack in to the pipe room. It was called the pipe locker, and he had a separate entrance. And there was a TV set, right? He told, Jack played this out very dramatically, giving us every comment and grimace on Hunt's face so we would derive the full benefit of the impact of the moment. We were laughing like crazy. And so he says, "Yes, sir, Captain." He says, "It looks like a television." He says, "Yes, sir." He says, "Do you know who it belongs to?" He says, "Yes, sir, I'm one of the owners." He says, "Oh, there are more of you than one." So he just drug on this interrogation full of drama, and this got all the first class into our room that night, so Jack could relate the whole story of the confrontation with Hunt. Well, anyway, so when Hunt ended the meeting with Dittrich, he said, "Mr. Dittrich, I want one name. That's all I want, is one name. So you get together with your cohorts who own this TV illegally and give me one name." So the way we made decisions in the Naval Academy was scissors, rock, and paper, or we called it hop, hop, ho. So by this time, John had 10 demerits to go before he was thrown out of the Naval Academy. And we could earn 150 demerits. If you had reached 150, they could throw you out. If you went over 150, you were told to start packing. So the group wanted to exclude John from the shake. He says, absolutely not. I'm the instigator of this whole thing. So they shook around, and it didn't fall on him. It fell on a guy who had 0 demerits, Hank Margot. And he got 40 demerits and a loss of a weekend. So that was the end of the television story. But it was very popular, and we really enjoyed it. Plebe year, you were allowed 300 demerits. Your youngster year, you were allowed 250. Your junior year, you were allowed 200, and your senior year, you were allowed 150. So it goes down 50 every year. Our second class year, there were about 10 of us, including Jack, John, and me, who had over 100 demerits. So we formed the Century Club in our company, and we took the picture in our room. And I'm holding the regulation book, and Jack is in the background, and John is holding a bayonet in his right hand. We all like to look very serious, but that just added to our fame. What happened to him? One day, he went over to play squash rackets, and he didn't have a mask on. And the ball hit him right in the eye. And so they hospitalized him for about a week. And he had to lay flat on his back, or he was going to lose his eyeball. But he recovered fully. But we knew how to get him to the hospital, so there was another time when he was, we took the excuse to just get him out of Bancroft Hall, so he would, especially when he got that close to the finish line. So we got him to the hospital twice, once for a legitimate reason. I don't know what reason we got him over the next time, but I think he had a cold or the flu or something. But we just welcomed to have him out of the Bancroft Hall for a week or so he wouldn't get any more merits. Linda and I and our 2 kids were in Korea. I was assigned to the U.S. Forces Korea headquarters, and it was a joint UN command. So it was UN command / U.S. Forces Korea, and I was in the communications staff. We lived out in town in a village called UN Village, because my wife was not an authorized sponsor. I mean, an authorized dependent, neither were my kids. But since she told me that I'd been so on sea duty that all she had was unaccompanied tours, so she was going to Korea. And what she did, she was able to get a job in the Army headquarters because she could get a clearance. So there were a lot of wives over there as clerk typists because they could get a clearance. So she went with me. So we were in Korea in 1967, and we heard over the radio, the Armed Forces, we had no television, all we had was Armed Forces radio. And we heard that he had been shot down, but they didn't know whether he was alive or dead. So Linda tearfully asked me, what'll happen to him? It says, well, if they capture him, if they don't deliberately kill him, I think he'll survive. Then about 3 days later, we heard that he was alive and he was a prisoner. And I remember thinking, 26th October, that's my mother's birthday. So that's how I found out. Oh, well, what information we could get from the wives and the prisoners' wives. By this time, organizations started to sprout up to support the prisoners of war and to publicize how they were being treated, to gain pressure on the Department of Defense and the State Department to negotiate for their release. So whatever information was available, I didn't correspond with him because I figured that was for his wife and his parents because they weren't going to let much mail through. We didn't know about that until afterwards, when all the stories broke after they came back. I was on sea duty, and I was the executive officer of LaSalle. We were in the Middle East, so I wasn't in the States when he came home. Well, when we were detached from LaSalle in September that year, he'd gotten home in March, and I was in the Middle East. We detached in September, and I was being sent to the Panama Canal Zone to command a naval communications station at Balboa. So we decided that we would drive to Panama. So we would come to Washington, D.C., buy a car, visit with my wife's sister and her husband. Then we would drive across to California, pick up my mother, and then we would go all the way down there. And I got extra leave to do this. So when we were in Washington, I called Jack Dittrich. He was in Norfolk. I said, Jack, have you had an opportunity to talk to John? He says, or see him? He says, I've talked to him on the phone. I said, how is he? He says, well, I'll tell you what he said. I said, John, how are you? He says, hey, Deacon, I'm great. Hey, no booze or broads for 5 years. What do you think? I said, he's fine. So I got hold of him. And I said, hey, John, it's Frank. He says, where are you, pal? I said, we're here in Washington. I'd like to come over and see you. So his wife, Carol, invited us we'd have a reunion dinner. So I saw him in about the middle of September. And when I saw him give a big hug, he said, I thought of you every day, pal. And I said, I prayed for you every day, John. We had a great reunion. We were at dinner. The conversation was as if we'd never stopped talking. It's remarkable. I couldn't help but I kept looking at him very closely, his facial expressions, his manner of speaking and behavior. And it was as if his POW experience had not happened. I was absolutely amazed. I could tell he was moving with a limp and awkwardness. And I knew by this time the physical condition of the prisoners, because of their injuries when they ejected out of the aircraft, as in John's case, or their torture. There were many with physical difficulties in just moving their bodies. So I could tell John was physically injured just by the way he moved. That was the only time I had a chance to see him. We had to go around to all the embassies, get visas, and to get the car and to visit with family, and then start our trip across California. So I only saw him that once. But when I relinquished command at Balboa, he was at Cecil Field with Ragg, his command, and he hosted me overnight. So I stayed at his house, and he had a dinner party in my honor, brought his staff. It was just delightful. And he told us war stories about how the prisoners would treat him and how he related to the other prisoners. So that was the only time I've had an opportunity to hear a first-hand account from John of what his treatment was like and how he related to the fellow POWs. I remember, yeah, one of his closest friends is Orson Swindle, who was shot down 6 years. He was there half a year longer than John when John arrived. He was a Marine 8, FA-8 pilot. I asked him how he got shot out. He says, oh, I hung around the target after I dropped my bombs like a dumbass, and I got shot down. Anyway, he was, through the tap code, one day John was talking happened to be talking to Orson. And Orson said, said he was a Marine, and they identified each other and introduced each other to the tap code. And then John said, "Orson, I would have joined the Marines, but I wasn't qualified." And Orson said, "What do you mean you weren't qualified?" He said, "No, my parents were married." That was typical. So they remained very close friends. That's a 5x5 grid of the alphabet, vertical and across. And if you tap two times, that means you go over 2 rows. And then tap 3 times, you go down 3 columns. Or 2 columns, 3 rows. That's the letter R, for example. So you tap out each letter. They got very good at it after years of using it, but it took a while. And one of the prisoners, who was a Rear Admiral, Bob Shoemaker, he was the number 2 shoot down in Vietnam. Ev Alvarez, a Mexican-American like me, was the first one. And he was there 8 years. So what they did is they removed 1 letter, so they had 25 rather than 26, so they had a perfect square. I forget what the letter was that Bob removed, but that's the tap code. That he took the life events, including his life, as just part of the human journey. Maybe part of it is his destiny, but he took life as it came. I don't know where I was when he died, probably on the West Coast in command, because I had commands for 8 years in San Diego, 2 ships and a squadron of ships. So I rarely got to Washington until 1984. I'm the class vice president, and we're in the midst of planning our reunion 60 next year. I said, "You got to come to that one, John. It's the last hurrah." So it'll be in October next year. If you've had similar experiences and you're in the same community, there was greater opportunity to interact and to experience the same life-changing events. And the bonding at Annapolis is intense. I mean, when you get together with your roommates or your classmates, your conversations continue like they started 50 years ago. So it's the bonding that takes place at Annapolis between classes, among classes. And a lot of that is imposed on you or instilled in you in your plebe year when you learn to look out for each other and help each other through adversity. So that's one thing to be a Navy family. Secondly, if you're assigned to a ship, that's your home and that's your family. I would go on 7-month deployments, and my association with my crew was my closest thing, my closest in a relationship. I wrote to my wife all the time, but I would see my sailors every day. So that's the kind of bonding you get with Navy people. You're on isolated, difficult duty, you depend on each other. So that leads to much more intense human relations and a band of brothers. Like everybody else on the news. I talked to him a couple of days later, and he always calls me pal. So he said, "I'm fine, pal. Don't worry about it. I said, we'll lick this." He's very optimistic, so. But that's, and I talked to him a little bit. He says, he's doing fine. He looks good. Well, because of his political accomplishments, he's rather unique in the family. The war interfered with his professional development as a naval officer. I think he would have had a fair shot at making flag had he not been a prisoner of war, and followed the normal career path. But it was foreshortened by the war, and he knew he couldn't command a carrier, so he was not going to make a flag. So he foreshortened, and he felt a lot of excitement and natural inclination with his political. He had tremendous social skills, and he just likes people, and people like him. And he's always for what's right for America, so it was natural. It was a natural evolution. And I think his evolution as a congressman, as a senator, as a presidential candidate, I mean, and being a candidate, I was with him in his campaign, both of his campaigns. We were called the Patriots. My job was to round up POWs to ride with him on the Straight Talk Express. So I heard a lot of these amazing stories. But I never saw anybody command a town hall like John McCain. Orson and I and Ev Alvarez and usually a couple of other POWs. Bud Day, he was always with us. It was so inspirational just associating with these guys. But we would do interviews on television, on the news shows, but the main event was always the town hall meeting. And John would introduce us all on the stage, and then we'd sit and he would talk to the voters. And he would take any question from anybody, and he wouldn't close down the town hall until everybody was exhausted with questions. He's the people he just set up a kind of electric atmosphere in the room by his presence and his magnetic personality and what he was saying. I mean, he reflected the interests of the American people, and I think he would have made a great president, and I wish he had. Oh, it was fun. I would sneak in and watch him dialoguing with the media. And he was just in his element. He loves the free flow of information. He doesn't think there's any illegitimate question. So I would marvel at watching some of these noted reporters talking to him in a very normal fashion, recording every word he said. So I was tremendously impressed with the openness of his campaign and the enthusiasm and energy. It was like going to a wake. It was awful because some of the dirty campaign tricks they pulled on John and just mean stuff they were saying. So then we learned the hard side of politics. If you lose, it's awful. But you recover. I asked Orson when John asked me to, well, did this actually happen when he was going to run to be a maverick, an insurgent campaign the first time against George Bush, the incumbent. He called me up. Had one of his staffers. First name was Paul. His last name escapes me for the minute. But Paul called me and he said, "Frank, the boss wants to see you." Now we had been to a party. He had invited Linda and I to a Christmas party at his condo, and it was all the media. And then the buzz was, "Is John going to declare?" And so we talked to him. He says, "Well, thank you for coming." And he wasn't going to tell me that he was going to run or not. So in January, when the buzz came out that he was going to run, he called me, and through Paul, and Paul says, "The man wants to see you." I said, what does he want to see me?" He says, "You know what he wants to see you about." I said, "No, I don't. You tell me exactly what he said." He says, "Okay, exactly what he says. Tell Frank to get his ass over here." So I showed up at 8 o'clock in the morning the next day, and they escorted me into his office. And he's sitting there with his feet up on the desk, reading the New York Times. And he says, "Hi, pal, thanks for coming." Then he starts pacing. He said, okay, you know I'm going to run. I said, yeah. He says, okay, I want you to start rounding up veterans. I want you to organize the class. I want you to have an event. And yeah, you're going to have to raise money. And then the phone rang, and he said, excuse me, I got to take this call. It's from New York. So I said there, holy cow, I've never been in politics. The only politics I ever knew was when I was president of my high school class. So I'm sitting there stunned. And then he hung up. He says, well, what do you think, pal? I said, well, the only thing you haven't asked me to do is measure the Oval Office for drapes. He says, okay, come with me. I got to go to the barber shop. So I ran with him downstairs. He got in the barber shop, and he started talking to the barbers. I'm standing there, and he looks at me and says, well, go ahead. You know what to do. I says, okay, I'll be in touch. So I went home, and I called Bob. I called his campaign manager. I didn't know. He says, McCain told me to come see you. So the outcome of it all was we held a terrific event at the Navy Memorial for John. And that got me involved in both campaigns. His friendship, just being able to talk. We never discuss political issues. We talk about friends and classmates and the good times we had together. It's a little nostalgic, but just being with him is interesting. If I want to ask a probing question, I will. I like his kids and his wife. Well, it was a stupid comment, a most thoughtless thing to say, and the most hurtful thing he could have said. But I admire John's response, which is he's free to say anything he wants, and he doesn't need to apologize to me. But I resent it. Let me tell you how we met his father. We had been roommates about a month. We had a very small room, steel bunks on top of each other, all our desks crammed together. One night we came back to the room. The protocol was you took your uniform off so you didn't soil it, and then you either studied in your pajamas or in your skivvies. Well, we were all in our skivvies, and we were studying. And then John got up, went over to the sink basin, and filled up a glass of water, and then he threw it on us. So he started a big water fight. I thought, well, maybe he thinks he's got to baptize us. Then we heard the double knock on the door. And so that's a signal that an upperclassman, either a first classman or an officer, is entering the room. So the protocol is you leap to your feet and stand at attention. So my back was to the door. John was facing the door, and then he says, Dad! And the captain said, carry on, gentlemen. And I turned around, and there was this Navy captain with gold stripes all over his. And he introduced himself. He says, I'm John's father. We were absolutely terrified. He said, God damn it, Johnny, no wonder you're flunking. Get dressed and come down to the rotunda. So we cleaned up the room while John was there. But that's how we met Captain McCain. We were putting on a stage play, mocking all the professors and the admiral and the faculty. It's called a No More Rivers ceremony, and it's traditionally when you poke fun at your professors. And I was dressed as one of the hall stewards. And so, I mean, I was a Hispanic, I looked like a steward to them. Yeah, so it was all good fun. I forgot to tell you our nicknames. John, nickname was John Wayne McCain. We gave him that. I was the Mex. Jack Dittrich, who I don't know why, was the deacon. And whenever I'd call John, he'd say, after a few minutes, he'd say, how's the deacon? Keith Bunting was we called him the straight arrow. And the rab for rabbit for bunny, bunny rabbit.